Hello and welcome to NSF's Compliance Unlocked. This is a series of podcasts where we're talking to various experts about different topics. Over the last couple of episodes, we've talked to a few people about inspections and remediation. And today we've got Marie O'Callaghan here talking about QPs and the role of QPs. Marie, welcome.
Thank you.
And you were indeed a QP, were you not?
I was a QP for a number of years in a steriles plant.
Fantastic. Well, that puts us in a really good position to answer lots of questions around this area. And interestingly, we have a great feature in this podcast series where the current speaker will ask the next speaker a question. And our previous speaker was Mike, and he wanted to know a bit about risk management, and particularly where the QP's responsibility is when it comes to risk management, especially around things like batch release and so on.
Okay, so I suppose nowadays risk management is one of the buzzwords we use in the industry, and the QP, by nature of their role, is managing risk all of the time. So they do need to be able to take information and make judgment calls on it based on their own experience and their knowledge. So there's an element of risk management all of the time. If you were waiting for the perfect batch with no notes, no deviations, no comments, then you're probably never going to release a batch. There's always going to be little wobbles in manufacturing, the nature of the business. So you are managing risk, but I wouldn't say that the QP is overall responsible for all risk management. You know, the QP has to employ a certain amount of risk management in their role, but they will feed into the risk management process of a site, but not necessarily be the owners of risk.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because really it sounds like there's a lot of experience that's needed to determine that risk management approach and how to really deploy and take your duties seriously.
Absolutely. You cannot be risk averse and do the role of a QP. You have to be able to live in the grey to a certain extent. Nothing is black and white. So you need to be able to live in the grey, and you need to be able to recognise the shades of grey that you're comfortable with.
Sounds challenging.
It is challenging, and different QPs will see things differently based on their own experience, what they've seen happening, what they see as potentials to happen. And so that's where the collaboration between QPs can work, and just making sure that you see things from different people's points of view, because the nature of risk management, people will see things from different points of view, and you need to be able to make a judgment on it. So it is all about those decision making, and it's always going to be decisions made based on risk management to a certain extent.
So what prepared you? I mean, you've obviously come through the ranks and you've been a QP for a long time, and obviously not doing that specifically now, but what prepared you to be a QP in the first place? Okay,
so I suppose since I started working, I started out in the laboratory working as an analytical chemist, and that enhanced what I had already learned in college because I had a master's degree in inorganic chemistry. So I worked in an API site for a number of years, and then I worked in research and development in an inhalation site. I worked then in regulatory affairs for a couple of years. I worked with validation of test methods, worked in quality systems, quality assurance. So I moved up through the ranks, always in the quality regulatory validation fields, and so got a very broad understanding of the industry as a whole, worked with a lot of different formulations and product types. And then I did do the qualification to become a QP in Ireland, which is a 2-year college course, with no intention really of becoming a QP, but because I had been a QA manager and I was working a lot with QPs, I felt that if I had the qualification at least, even if I was never on a licence, I would be able to speak peer-to-peer with them because we had the same level of education.
But then you still went ahead and became a QP.
I did about 10 years after
Right.
I got the qualification. So I had 10 additional years of experience before I ever went on a licence. So I really feel that stood to me, because in those 10 years, I got into working with steriles and more involved with quality systems and designing systems and managing systems. So that experience was really invaluable.
And do you think that's still the case now, that that's still what happens now, or do you think the role's changed over time?
I think over time it has changed. When I started working, the QP was a really, really elevated role that was something that people aspired to the middle end of their career. And so they needed a lot of experience to get in there. When I started, the first QP that I met, she was spoken about in hushed tones because she was the QP and she was very important and she was the one who was making all the final decisions. And I didn't think that I would ever do that because I thought that's such a responsible role. There's no way I will be able to do that. Nowadays, I think people move into it much faster. It is seen as a stepping stone. There is a shortage of QPs now because the industry has grown so much, and there are so many batches being released at the moment that there's never enough QPs to make those decisions.
Very difficult.
So people also see it as because there is a shortage. It's a very well-paid position and people aspire to having that role, and people are being moved into those roles a lot quicker than they used to be.
Well, that's interesting. So does that present like a different sort of set of risks for the organisation or even for the individual going into that?
I think it does. It does present a risk to the organisation, but to the individual is where I would have the most concerns because it is such a responsible role. And the decisions aren't always easy. Without having a lot of experience behind you and without having a lot of experienced QPs around you, it can be a very pressurised role. And, I have seen people do it for a couple of years and then stop, So instead of now being something to aspire to that, in my career when I grow up, I'm going to be a QP. Now I will be a QP for a couple of years and move on. And I think if people move on from it, the industry is losing a lot of experience and a lot of, coaching ability and a lot of development ability that those QPs could bring to the role.
And what do you think might change that model? I mean, what could help perhaps those QPs stay in their role a lot longer? I mean, is there a nice community of QPs that speak frequently, for example?
Well, I think QPs do need other QPs. And it was one of the things that I enjoyed most about the role where I worked. We had a very strong QP community. We helped each other out and we helped each other with those difficult decisions. And being able to rely on your colleagues to have your back to a certain extent. I think one of the things that happens is that the QP is challenged by the rest of the site when there's a difficult decision to be made. And when I'm talking about difficult decisions, I'm talking about those batches that might be more challenging to release or the ones that aren't going to get released at all. If a QP really has a problem, and it can happen that a batch has not got an essential test that without it it's out of compliance, or it has actually failed a test. So even if the QP feels even failing that test, it's still not going to be a risk to patients, but the QP cannot release it because that's one of the criteria it's beyond which you can do. You really can't release it.
Must be really isolating for the QP at those points particularly. I mean,
how
would they manage that?
At those points, it is very, very challenging because when you cannot release a batch, you really have to be able to justify that to senior managers, to production managers, to the rest of the site. You really have to be able to justify that. Nobody ever asks you why you release a batch, but they really will make you work for not releasing a batch. So that's where a community of QPs is really important. Personality-wise, someone might be very risk-averse, and having that community of QPs, you will have the discussion about whether or not you are all on the same side or whether somebody can see a grey patch that you can't see.
Yeah, I can understand that.
So that has proven very useful for me on occasion, where somebody can not persuade you to change your mind, but show you another way of looking at it. One of the things that I would have always said, and as a community of QPs, we would have said, it has to pass the red face test. If somebody asked me, how could I possibly release a batch with that deviation on it or whatever, I have to be able to convince myself that it's okay. So I feel that the younger QPs, are not younger, but, less experienced QPs, when they come up against those challenging experiences, if you have a lot of them, it can put you off, and it can be, it can expedite you moving on from the role.
Yeah, I can totally understand that, and it's difficult, isn't it, with such a challenging role? I guess individuals must need certain attributes or certain elements to them, perhaps in their personality traits, to be able to cope with that sort of job. I mean, what sort of person really is the ideal person to be a QP in your view?
Well, I think one of my attributes is that I'm quite stubborn.
Brilliant.
And I think that is probably one of the things which can be a blessing and a curse when you're a QP. Like I said, passing the red face test and convincing yourself. But, when you've convinced yourself that it's a no, it's difficult to climb down from that. And I think one of the things that you need to be able to do is to have self-awareness of the times when you're just being stubborn for the sake of it, yep. Not digging your heels in too early, and not being too negative about things. One of the things that, when I was thinking about this podcast and about what it was like to be a QP, one of the things that I feel I brought to the role was I always assumed that I was going to release a batch when I was reviewing it. I always assumed this batch is going to pass unless I can find a reason to reject it. So I would go into it with a positive mindset because, I worked in a site that had a good quality system. It was designed right. We had good batch records. We had a deviation system that they were investigated properly. So, even if a batch had a fairly big challenge with it, I would say it's probably going to be okay rather than it's not. So therefore, I feel that when I decided it's not going anywhere.
You've got a valid reason
I've
for
got
it.
a valid reason for it, and that people accepted that, I wasn't someone who was saying no to everything. That, I was open to living in the grey a little bit.
Yeah, and I can imagine there's probably scrutiny as well, which probably means you need to be a little bit calm. But
Absolutely. I mean, I do remember once having to reject 3,000 vials of a much bigger batch, but this 3,000 vials had issues. And I remember saying to the head of quality at the time that I would have been able to justify murder easier than justifying the rejection of those 3,000 vials, because it was just coming up with more than one reason why I couldn't release them.
Wow. It seems like it was probably a clear-cut decision then by the sounds of it.
It was a clear-cut decision, but it was challenged so many times.
And I guess that goes back to what you were saying earlier, that if it's a batch that's going to pass, you probably won't get
no one will ever
questions,
ask you.
But the other way around, maybe not. Let's go down a different track, because obviously you touched on there earlier about the fact that the volume of QPs coming through is less just because of the way the whole system has changed. How do organisations sort of plan for succession? I mean, how do they get through that? I mean, is recruitment and retention a better piece, or does there need to be something in place to ensure that there's a succession plan there?
I think it's probably an area that the industry is challenged with, early on in their careers. I think a lot of QA people feel that's something that they might aspire to, but I don't think that necessarily systems are set up in such a way that they can get there in a fairly straightforward way. I think the QP has a great opportunity to coach QA people into the role, but a lot of the time, because QPs are expensive, their ability to coach, or the time allowed to coach people, is reduced because, we're paying them to review batches, and all this coaching business takes time. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that the succession planning in theory should work fine, but in reality the time just isn't allowed for it. And I think maybe sites don't think about succession until QPs have left.
Perhaps it's too late, yeah. I was going to say that. And then you end up with a contract QP probably, which is more expensive again.
That's more expensive again. And as well as that, one of the things that QPs bring to the table is that they're invested in the site, and it's in their best interest that the quality system is working well, and all of that sort of thing is going well. But if people are contract QPs, they're not as invested, and so therefore it can be a very transactional relationship. So they will come in, review the batch, and they don't have that same invested, the same interest in making sure that the batch gets released. And
I guess there's an impact in terms of just maintaining the quality culture as well. If you're contract QP, you're not going to be as you say, as invested in the organisation as a whole. Whereas if you're there as a permanent QP, it might be slightly different.
Yeah, I think you have more of an influence on the quality culture and more interested in the quality culture if you're there as an employee, because while the QP has to remain independent to a certain extent, the culture is theirs as well as everybody else's, and if they are involved in coaching QA, if they're part of the system, if they're part of developing the systems and reviewing the system, part of management review, it can create a much more comfortable place for QPs to be, whereas if you're a contract QP, and I'm not dissing contract QPs, there is a place for that because,
Definitely, yeah.
But I think even as a contract QP, it can be quite lonely then because you are an individual contributor and you don't belong anywhere. The system isn't yours and you can be very dispassionate about it. But I'm a bit of a quality nerd. I think the idea of a nice quality culture where everybody from the cleaners to the QPs to the engineers to manufacturing, where everybody is doing their best to make sure that everything is right first time and that that the system is flowing and it's all joined up, a bit of joined up thinking. I just feel that when that happens, that it's just such a nice place to work.
And that sounds lovely in an ideal world, but it's not always like that, is that? And I do think there's something about having a healthy level of tension between perhaps a QP and other parts of the organisation, because that's how you get sort of, I guess, diversity of input and therefore the best kind of answers in the long run. Would you agree with that? I mean, or would you say that a happy, very relaxed environment is better?
Well, I think there will always be a little bit of, I won't call it friction, but I suppose tension is a good word. But, I think that's where everybody learns. I've had situations where we've had difficult issues and engineers will be looking at something and going, but it works. And quality are looking at it going, yeah, it works, but it's not compliant, and if everybody sees things from other people's points of view, you will find that there's more than one way to be compliant. So I think progress will always involve some level of change, and change will always involve some level of risk. So, we're never going to progress if we don't shake things up a little bit sometimes. So I have learned on occasion to, have to step back and go, oh, wow, that does work, even though my first instinct was that's not going to work. So I do think that listening to other people's points of view, again, we're talking about the grey areas, aren't we?
Again, yeah, absolutely. Just one final question for you, Marie. I mean, I'm interested a little bit in terms of a QP's career pathway and, do they go into leadership? Is that a natural transition, or do they make good leaders? I mean, because we often talk about very technical people and sort of managers and leaders, and they're not always necessarily the same people. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But what about QPs?
I think QPs have to have a certain level of leadership skills. They have to be able to talk as an equal to fairly senior managers, and they have to be respected as senior technical people. I spoke already about them maybe coaching QA people along the way. So they do need to have that level of leadership skills. I don't think they necessarily need to be managers. And I think, the industry probably can't afford to have the QPs, having 12 or 14 reports and having to do all of that sort of people management as well as the management of a quality system. Nowadays, people moving into the QP role earlier in their career probably do see themselves as moving into management at a later point. I think QP is a great role to have for a long term, as a long term goal as well. So I think they need to be recognised as management, but not necessarily managers.
Makes sense. That's really helpful. So that brings me to the end of our session today. But one thing I do want is a question for our next speaker from you, and that's Catherine Kay, who obviously works at NSF and is very involved in all of our training, particularly for QPs. What would your question be for Catherine?
Well, I suppose going through what we've been talking about and the fact that QPs are moving, or that people are moving into the role of QP earlier in their career. And I was just wondering, it's such a different role now than what it started out as 30 years ago. How has the QP training had to evolve over the years to accommodate the new group of trainee QPs coming forward?
And I think given everything you've said, it's probably quite a lot. So it'll be great to pick up with her when we chat to her next.